Week 16 on its way Christmas night, so no Thursday night game this week. It's Friday night instead, kicking off with Minnesota Vikings at the New Orleans Saints. But here's the top 30 wide receivers going into Week 16 here. Number one, who else would it be but Davante Adams of the Green Bay Packers? Each and every week, Adams, he puts up huge numbers. Last week was a fluky week, I believe. Adams, he didn't have a good game at all, really. But Adams this week, he's got a great matchup versus Tennessee. I think this game, both teams are going to go up and down the field, and it's going to be a shootout in this one. And it wouldn't surprise me if Adams has 120 to 130 yards in this one and finds the end zone one or two times. So Adams, he's a stud. He's the best receiver this season in fantasy football. And this week, I think he will be again. Number two, Tyreek Hill of the Kansas City Chiefs. What a season it's been for Tyreek Hill. 15 touchdowns now on the season. And last week, he found the end zone once again versus the New Orleans Saints. And this week, he's got a great matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons that give up tons of fantasy points and points in general to football teams. And this week, I think he could burn one to the end zone on a deep ball from Patrick Mahomes in this one. Hill, what a season, like I said. He's got double-digit fantasy points in every game except two this season. And this week, I could think he could score 25 to 30 points in this one. The next guy's DeAndre Hopkins of the Arizona Cardinals. Hopkins, he's been good the last few weeks now after going into a slump. Kyler Murray, he's looking for him, and Murray's numbers are going up as well as Hopkins when these two guys connect and hit on some big plays. And Hopkins, the last 2 weeks, he's went over 100 yards, and he found the end zone last week as well versus Philly in that shootout. And this week, he's got a great matchup versus the San Francisco 49ers that last week they gave up 40 points to a crummy backup Dallas Cowboy team. So this week, I think Hopkins, he's going to have his way. Richard Sherman might be on him, but that don't matter to me. Sherman, he's not an elite corner, in my opinion, like he was years ago with the Seattle Seahawks. So Hopkins, I think he's going to get over the 100-yard mark once again and possibly find the end zone. Number 4, Stephon Diggs of the Buffalo Bills. This guy's having an insane season, is Diggs, leading all receivers in receiving yards and catches. And last week he put on a show versus the Denver Broncos on that Saturday night ball game. Him and Allen, what a connection it's been this season. These two guys on the same page since week 1 here when Diggs arrived in Buffalo. And now this game is at New England, but Stephen Gilmore, I don't think he's going to play. Last week he left with a bad leg injury. Still no final word on what the status of Gilmore is heading into the week. But Diggs, he's having a great season, like I said. Corners can't stop him. He's putting up huge numbers. And this week on Monday Night Football versus New England, I think he has another big game. Number 5, Calvin Ridley of the Atlanta Falcons. Ridley, he might be the number 1 going forward the rest of the way here for the Atlanta Falcons. Julio Jones, the injury bug caught up to him this year, but it doesn't matter. Without Jones now, the last few games, Ridley, he's had big fantasy games and gone over 100 yards and also found the end zone. And this week versus Kansas City, this game, Atlanta's probably going to be trailing early and often in this one, where Matt Ryan and the Falcons have no choice but to throw. And Calvin Ridley, he's a tough receiver to cover. And this game versus the Chiefs, I think he's going to have another big game as well and help your fantasy team big time this week. Number 6, Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers. Last week was a huge disappointment for Allen. I was surprised he played in that game, and he almost cost me, to be honest, of advancing to the next round. I started him, and I only got 2.5 points out of him. But Allen, he was limited this week with the extra 10 days of rest. Allen should be good to go now here versus Denver, a team he usually has a good career games adverse. And this week, I think he could exploit that defense. Stephon Diggs, he just exploded for 147 yards versus that D. So Allen, I think he'd have a good game. Number 7, DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. Metcalf, he's been a monster this season, and he might be the next Calvin Johnson, in my opinion. And Metcalf, tough matchup this week. He's going to have Jalen Ramsey on him, but you still got to play your stud players, especially if you got this far to the championship here. You cannot bench Metcalf in any situation. I don't care who's covering him, because this guy, it takes him a play or two to have a huge fantasy day, and I think Metcalf still could do that even with Jalen Ramsey on him. Number 8, A.J. Brown of the Tennessee Titans. A.J. Brown, he's been a monster this season for this Tennessee Titan team since he came back from injury In week 4, he's found the end zone in every game except 2. And Brown this week, he's got a good matchup versus the Green Bay Packers, where we saw DJ Moore last week go over 100 yards versus him. And Brown this week, I think he's going to find the end zone once again versus the Packers. Like I said, this game will be a shootout. No one, I think, could cover Brown with his running ability and his physical physique of breaking tackles and hitting the open field. Number 9, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. Justin Jefferson, what a rookie season for this start. And last week, he went over 100 yards once again. And this week, it's going to be a game where they're probably going to be trailing versus the New Orleans Saints. It's an indoor game in the Superdome. It's Christmas Day. You know, Jefferson, in his first season and on his first Christmas Day game, obviously, he's going to try to impress and have a big ball game. And I think no one in that Saints secondary is going to stop him. So I think Jefferson, he could have a big game, over 100 yards, and find the end zone. Number 10, Allen Robinson of the Chicago Bears. Allen Robinson, his numbers have gone up a lot since Mitch Trubisky's been inserted back into the starting lineup. Last week was a down game for him, but that was more of David Montgomery having a big game and them just keep feeding him over there in Chicago. This week at Jacksonville, he's versing his former team, and I think Robinson has a field day here where he shows up his former team that they should have paid him, and he goes off. Number 11 at wide receiver, DeAndre Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Johnson, he's a target machine, and once again we saw versus Cincinnati with double-digit targets. It seems like each and every week he's getting the targets. He's got a couple drops along the way as well, is Deontay Johnson, but he makes a lot of big plays for this Pittsburgh team. He's going to get open, a lot of bubble screens, a lot of underneath routes, and he's a tough cover. And even with the drops, he puts up big fantasy points as Johnson. And this week versus Indy, it's a pretty tough matchup. I still think Johnson finds a way to have a good fantasy day. I mean, he's a guy you definitely can't bench, and you got to start him no matter what. Number 12, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Last week, Evans went over 100 yards for the first time in a long time. It was good to see. And this week, another plus matchup for Evans and the Tampa Bay Bucks versus the Detroit Lions, who can't stop nobody on defense. Receivers have big games versus them usually each and every week. And this week, it's another indoor game for Evans and the Bucks. And I think Tampa Bay, all these receivers, are going to have pretty decent games over there. And Evans, I think he'll at least find the end zone in this one with 50 yards minimum. Number 13, Robert Woods of the Los Angeles Rams. Robert Woods, he's been a great fantasy player all season, and he's the possession and reception guy over there in Los Angeles, and he reminds me of Deontay Johnson in a few ways. A lot of targets, a lot of underneath routes, a lot of bubble screens, and this week he versus a Seattle team that gives up the most fantasy points to wide receivers. So I think Robert Woods could get you a 15 to 20 point fantasy day, and he's a perfect number 2 receiver in your lineup this week. Number 14, Adam Thielen of the Minnesota Vikings. Thielen, he's been up and down this season, but one consistency with him, he's been finding the end zone this year. He's got double-digit touchdowns, and this week he's got a pretty good matchup versus the New Orleans Saints. Last week we saw Hill have a good game versus him, and I think Thielen, he could have a decent game, 50 or 60 yards, and find the end zone. Number 15, Julio Jones of the Atlanta Falcons. Julio Jones, he's been hampered with that hamstring injury on and off all season, and now he's missed the last 2 games. This week he's got a matchup at Kansas City if he's going to play, but I don't think he's going to play Jones, but I got to put him on the list anyway, because a lot of managers took Jones early in the first round, and Jones, when you don't think he's going to play, he plays these games. So I think this week he does come back. He did some work on the side today in practice. So Julio Jones, I think he'll be all right to play, and I think he's a number 2 receiver in your lineup this week. Number 16, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's been an inconsistent receiver, and this year it's because all the mouths Tom Brady's got to feed over there, and plus some injury problems. But Godwin this week at Detroit, I think he has a big game. I think he's going to make plays and do some good things as Godwin, and he's a receiver I think you could trust going on the matchup and the offense that he's in. So Godwin, I wouldn't be surprised if he has 8 or 9 catches for 70, 80 yards and possibly finding the end zone in this one. Number 17, Terry McLaurin of the Washington football team. The struggles have continued for McLaurin the last few weeks. Last week he had a decent fantasy game, but he's not putting up the numbers he was putting up early in the season. He's had a couple dud performances and some mediocre performances, but this week he's got a pretty good matchup versus the Carolina Panthers. Well, I think McLaurin, he's going to get open and make some plays, and he's one of the best route runners in the NFL, in my opinion, to McLaurin. So hopefully Alex Smith comes back this week, and these two guys get on the same page, and McLaurin has a good game. Number 18, Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. Cooper Kupp, it's been a weird season for him, and I thought he would have been the better receiver coming into the year for this Ram offense, but it's been Robert Woods, obviously. But this week, another good matchup for Kupp. Last week, he didn't do that much versus the New York Jets. This week, Seattle, they give up the most fantasy points to wide receivers. And Kupp, I think he'll at least get double-digit fantasy points and hopefully more. Number 19, Brandon Aiyuk, the impressive rookie of the San Francisco 49ers. He's got a good matchup at the Arizona Cardinals. Aiyuk, he finds the end zone each and every week or gets 100 yards now. He's the number one over there. George Kittle, it's possible he plays this week, but I still wouldn't count on it. Deebo Samuel, he's out for the season, it looks like. So Aiyuk, he's going to get a bunch of targets. He's going to get a bunch of plays. And in this game, they're probably going to be trailing. So he's going to get good volume as well. Number 20, Marvin Jones of the Detroit Lions. Marvin Jones, he's been great, especially with Kenny Golladay, who's been out multiple weeks now. And this week, probably Golladay won't come back. Detroit's out of contention, and Marvin Jones, he's the number one over there in Detroit. And plus, he's a free agent after the season, I believe. So he's playing better. He's looking for another big contract this offseason. And I think versus Tampa Bay, he could get 60, 70 yards and find the end zone. Number 21 at wide receiver this week, Jarvis Landry of the Cleveland Browns. Landry, he's impressed now. The last 3 out of 4 weeks were big fantasy games. And last week versus the New York Giants, he found the end zone. And this week, he's got another amazing matchup versus the New York Jets. The Browns, they don't got to travel back. They stayed in New York, I'm guessing here. And they're going to play at MetLife for the second week in a row. And Landry, the Jets have no one in that secondary that's really going to stop him. So I think Landry, he could hit 15 to 18 fantasy points in this game. And you could trust him as a number 2 receiver. And Landry, he's been a guy I really haven't trusted all season. Number 22, Brandon Cooks of the Houston Texans. He's got a pretty good matchup versus the Cincinnati Bengals. This week is Cooks. Cooks, he's the number 1 over there in Houston, but Kiki Cootie, he's been playing very well as also with Will Fuller suspended. But Cooks, I think he could get open. He can make a few plays. Watson, he spreads that football around to everybody. But Cooks, he's been good for double digits pretty much each and every week in PPR leagues, and I think he does that again here in Week 16. Number 23, Amari Cooper of the Dallas Cowboys. Last week was a horrible game for Cooper, where he had 4 fantasy points. But this season, it's been a good season considering what happened with Dak Prescott's injury and a few quarterbacks playing along the way when Dalton went down, with scrubs like Garrett Gilbert and Benny DiNucci. But Cooper, he's got double-digit fantasy games, except in 3 this season, so that's good. And he usually has good games versus Philly. He's got a good track record, so I think Cooper has a sneaky good game this week. Number 24, Corey Davis of the Tennessee Titans. Corey Davis, he's been great this season, and last week he caught a long 75-yard touchdown for the Tennessee Titans, and obviously he went over 130 yards receiving in that game. And this week versus Green Bay, I think he has another good game as Corey Davis. I wouldn't be surprised if he could find the end zone in this one and go over 100 yards. This is going to be a shootout. This is a big ball game for both teams in this one. And Davis, I could trust him easily here as a number 2 receiver of flex. Number 25, Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks. Lockett, he just hasn't been good, man. The last 6 or 7 weeks, he had that insane game versus the Arizona Cardinals in Week 8, I believe, for 15 catches, 200 yards, and 3 touchdowns. But since then, I think he's only had 1 or 2 touchdowns as Lockett. The Seattle offense, they've taken a lot of steps back over the last few weeks, and Lockett, he's only getting 5 catches, 50 yards, it seems like. You still got to start him with the big play potential, unless you got these other guys I've mentioned ahead of him so far. So Lockett at 25, he could go either way, a total dud performance or have a breakout. 26, DJ Moore of the Carolina Panthers. Last week, Moore came back off the COVID list, and he had a big ball game over 100 yards in that one, and he found the end zone as well. And DJ Moore, him and Bridgewater, maybe they're starting to get things going, even though the season's over next week for the Panthers in Week 17. But Moore this week, he's got a decent matchup versus Washington. Washington, their defense is solid in their front seven, but the secondary receivers can make plays versus this team. And I think DJ Moore, he's good for a few plays in this one. Number 27, his teammate, Robbie Anderson. Anderson, only the third time this year. He didn't reach double-digit fantasy points last week, and I think this week at Washington, Bridgewater and the Panthers, they're going to have a decent game, and if Christian McCaffrey's back, it's going to open up the receiving game and the coverage for Moore and Anderson, in my opinion. So I think Anderson, he could get his decent game here with 6 catches, 70 yards in this one. Number 28, Chase Claypool of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Claypool, he was on a tear for a while, but the last few weeks, maybe he's hitting the rookie wall or whatever, but this Steeler team hasn't played well. Claypool, he's had mediocre to poor performances, like I mentioned, and this matchup versus Indianapolis ain't a great one, but Claypool, he still has upside, and if you're in a deep league or you start multiple flexes or what receivers, more than 2, Claypool's still a guy you got to go to and start this week. Even with the tough matchup, his potential and his playmaking ability, he could have a big game each and every week. You just never know with Claypool. He's still getting a role, and I think this Pittsburgh team, they need a patented win this week after losing 3 in a row, and all these guys will step up. Number 29, Hollywood Brown of the Baltimore Ravens. He's been doing well since he's been calling for the ball more. And just as a whole, this Baltimore offense has really come together now the last 3 weeks after being decimated by the virus versus the Steelers a few weeks ago, where they had about 20 guys out for that game. But Brown, he's got a decent matchup versus the Giants. It seems like he's making big plays now each and every week is Brown, like he did last season. But he was struggling for about 10 weeks this year, but he's finally stepped up. So Brown, he could be a decent play this week, and he's a number 2 to flex option. And the 30th and final wide receiver, we're going back to Pittsburgh, is JuJu SmithSchuster of the Pittsburgh Steelers. JuJu, he's just been inconsistent this year. I thought he would have a big season, but he hasn't had a 100-yard game the whole season. I don't know if his head's in the game or what, but JuJu, he's declined now the last 2 seasons, and maybe with Antonio Brown there, it opened up a lot for SmithSchuster, because he had his best seasons when Brown was with Pittsburgh, and now is the number 1 guy pretty much the last 2 seasons. He's just not getting the job done, is SmithSchuster, where people drafted him and where Pittsburgh Steelers expected from him. So SmithSchuster, he's on the verge here of being played or benched, in my opinion, at the 30th option of receiver versus Indy. It's a tough matchup, like I said, but we'll see if these Steelers guys wake up after a bad 3 weeks in a row for this ball club. So that's the top 30 wide receivers I'm ranking here heading into Week 16.